Hello everybody, welcome to today's lecture on Windows Forms programming. This is lecture 12.3, how to add components to a window. And today I'll just focus on adding a button, a label, and a text box. And as the videos progress, we'll get more complicated in the GUI elements that we add to a form component. Okay, so today's material comes from Chapter 12 of my book, C# for Artists. Chapter 12 is Windows Forms Programming, and C# for Artists is the book, second edition. This book is available from Pulp Free Press. Okay, and I use this book to teach in my classes. Alrighty, so let's return back. Okay, adding components to a window. In the previous video, video 12-2, I showed you how to manipulate form properties, how to change the background color, the background image, set the title bar text, etc. Okay, so in today's video, we're going to talk about adding some components to that window. Okay, now there's just a couple tricks to it. Really, it's not that hard. All right. The tools I'm going to be using today include, I'm not going to get fancy with Visual Studio. I'm just going to use Notepad++, text editor to type in the code, and I'm going to compile with either the console or I've got Windows PowerShell up here as well. Okay, so without further ado, we got some material already in the book. For an example, I'll just kind of go over that code and then I'll type it in line by line and explain each line as I'm doing it. Okay, so let's return back to the text. Okay, adding components. Really the trick is you need to have a form, right? So you're going to have a class that you create. In this particular case, I have the class's name Component Demo, and it extends form. Okay. The form is in the System.Windows.Forms Namespace, and in this particular example, I've only included three, or using three namespaces, right? System, System.Windows.Forms, and System.Drawing. Okay, I'm going to create three private fields, one for a button, one for a text box, and one for a label. And the reason I want these fields to be private is I want access within. Well, I don't need to make them public, right? Usually you keep the fields private to the class itself, but I want these to be scoped at the class level. In other words, they're fields and they're not local variables in some method. And the reason I want to do that is I want to be able to access, like for example, the text of a button or the text of a text box or the label, right? I want to access these components, in various methods, right, throughout the class. You don't always have to do it that way, but in this case, that's what I'm doing. All right, so I've got my three, and I like to use underscore for my field names. Okay, what I like doing that because one, it lets me see at a glance which of my identifiers are class-wide fields. Okay, and then a local variable within a method would have no underscore on it. So it just helps me keep my code straight in my head when I'm looking at it. All right, next we have a constructor, and this particular constructor allows me to, it's got, I've given it 1, 2, 3, 4, right? I've given it 4 parameters, 4 integer parameters, x, y for the upper left-hand corner, and the width, okay? And what I'm doing is I'm using it to set the bounds of the window, so I can set the dimensions of the form, okay, when it displays or when it comes up on the screen. Then I'm going to set this text to component demo, and then I have a method called initialize components. I'll probably change the name of that to initialize component. And the reason I do that is when you create a GUI in Visual Studio creates a method called initialize component. Okay. Now I have another constructor. This one here is the default constructor. on line 17. And it calls, this is an example of constructor chaining, this constructor calls this constructor, okay? And I give it as a default value 100, 200, 400, and 200, okay? So 400, upper left-hand origin point of the form is 100x and 200y, and then a width of the form is 400 and the length is 200. Now in the initialize components method, starting on line 19, I create the label, okay, underscore label 1 equals new label, and most of these form components, right, that you're going to add, they only have a default constructor, right? So you just, the rhythm of the coding, right? I like to talk about the rhythm of coding. If you're doing your GUI by hand, is you create the component, and then you set the properties on the component, right? And I do this for each of the components I'm adding. So I'm going to create a label, right? And then I create the button. And there's no particular order that you have to do it unless one component has to exist before another, right? And that's the only time that would make any difference. Now, once I've created my components, the code spills over onto the next page. I use this .controls, and the controls property on the form, this is another form property, has a collection, okay, of controls, and you add the control that you want to add to the form into the collection of the form's controls. Now, the order that you add the components is important. So if I add a label first, followed by a button, followed by a text box, that's exactly how they appear, okay, in the form. So in this particular case, in figure 12-1 that you see right now on the screen, I've got a label. We'll take a look at this picture right here. I've got a label, I got a button, and I got a text box. All right, and that's because that's the order that I added them to the form, and they will. All right, so, and they'll usually just flow right in. All right, so let's go ahead and and then I have a main method at the very bottom. I usually put my main methods down at the bottom. Static void main, okay, and then I use the application class application.run. The run is a static method, and I create an instance of component demo, and then compile it, run it, and we'll see what it does. All right, so let's switch from, I'm going to just move this over here so I can reference it when I'm typing in the code. And then we might play around with some of this stuff once we get it running. Okay, so let me pull up Notepad++, and I'm going to go ahead right away and save. Right, let me change my directory. I'm going to call my, just like I did in the book, component demo. Componentdemo.cs is the name of the source file. So right off the bat, I'm going to include my using statements, using system, using System.Windows.Forms, using System.Drawing. Okay. And then public class component demo extends form, and just come on down, and then I like to put a comment in class. Alrighty, back up a couple spaces here. Now, for the first thing I want to do is I want to declare my private fields. You know, another thing too that's good is you can use the region, right? Declaration, okay, the region, I guess attribute, and I can say private field, and then you just block it off with end region, like that. And then what happens is you can collapse this, and even in Notepad++, right, you create little regions for your code. So here I'm going to have private label label 1, private, button 1. And again, order does not matter. Text box. Order doesn't matter when you're putting in these private fields, okay? So they're private, label underscore label 1 underscore button 1 underscore text box. Next region I'm going to put is constructors. And then end region. All right. So the first constructor, I think I'll start off with the first constructor. Well, I'll start off with the primary constructor. All right, so public. Now remember, when you're adding a constructor, there's no return type. You could put void here, right? Thinking you were making a constructor, and you'd be rudely awakened when you tried to run it, and you know, it's not going to give you an error because it is a method, right? But it's just not a constructor. So int y, int width, int height. Open brace, closing brace. Now what I'm going to do is, and the reason we needed the system.drawings is I'm going to say this dot bounds, okay, equals new rectangle, and it requires x and y, right? Height for the upper left hand corner, and requires a width and height, like that. Okay, now we need I'm going to set the title bar text on the. I'm setting this on the window. Text equals component demo. Alrighty. And pretty much now the next thing I'm going to call is the initialize component. You could name this method anything you wanted. I mean, since you're typing all this code in by hand, right? So, and it doesn't have to be public. It could be private. Private void, because it's just used internally. So initialize component. Ah, I forgot. You know what? I'm not in this. Let me just do this later. So I need the other constructor first. Public component demo, like that. And all it's going to do, right, since it's a default constructor, it's got no arguments, it's going to then just, with a colon, say this, and it's going to pass in 100. You could make these anything you wanted to. Just experiment where you want the window to pop up. 200, okay, and 400, 200, all right. And we might have to experiment with this. And then open brace, closing brace. All right, and that does it for our constructors. Now, as a matter of form, I really do prefer, and this is just totally my preference, is I like to have the default constructor be the first constructor, like that. All right. Doesn't make any difference, really. It doesn't. But I just like it that way. Okay, so I'm done with the constructor region here. All the constructors are there. Now I'm going to make another region. I'll call this private fields. I'm sorry, private methods. Let me get my head out of my butt. End region. So, all right, so what I need is couple more spaces there. The initialize component method, private void initialize component. Okay, no arguments. Open brace, closing brace. And now I'm going to create Now what I do like to do is, unless there's a compelling reason not to, since I'm typing in this code myself, I like to work in the order that I declared them. So label, I'll create the label, I'll create the button, I'll create the text box. And again, that's just nothing, right? That's just a personal way I like to work when I do this stuff by hand. So label 1. Label 1, okay, equals new label, like that. So create the label. Next thing, label. You have to create the object, right? Label 1 equals, dot. Now you can call a property, or you can access properties and methods on your object. Once you've created the object, if you don't do this line right here, label 1 equals new label, and then you try to access that object via that reference, you're going to get a null reference exception when you run your code. And that's not going to happen until you run your code, right? So your program will crash. Now I'm going to set the text, okay, equals, this is a label. Just keep this stuff simple. Like that. Okay. Next. And then I think I'm going to set the location. Label 1. So if you just put these components in willy-nilly, right? If you just added them without setting their location, they would go one on top of the other. Unless you used a flow layout panel. Okay, and I'm not using a flow layout panel. So what I'm doing is I'm going to actually set the upper left corner of each of these components so that we can see them in the window. Okay, and they'll be statically glued to that position. They won't move around. I could get them to move around. I could write code that lets me click on the button and move it any place I wanted to in that form. And I might do that just to show you how that works. Okay, but anyway, I'm going to just go ahead and statically, place these in a location. All right. But when you're programming GUI, sometimes you might want to do that. Most of the times you don't. You like your components to kind of flow freely with the window as it resizes to make your window look nice and professional, right? All right. So I'm going to set the location. Okay. Now the location is a point. It's the upper. When I say set the location property on a component is the upper left corner of that component's window. Okay, so and it's a point, equals new point. Okay, and I'm going to give it 25. So this is x25 and y25. So 25 down from the region of the window, from the screen. Okay, or I should say from the window in which it appears. So the window is going to be created with 100, at least the default constructor. If the default constructor is called, the window comes 100 pixels down from the left of the screen, and the Y component is 200 pixels from the top edge of the screen, and then this label will then be, the totally from the edge of the screen will be 125, because it'll be 25 pixels from the point of origin of the window. So if the window, that's the 0 point for the window. 100, 200 is the 0 point for the upper left-hand corner of the window, and then 25 relative to the upper left-hand corner. That's where this button or this label is going to be. All right, so I got my label. Now the next is the button. Button 1 equals new button. Okay, and I can just move along here since we have talked about most of those points. Button 1 dot text. I will say that the text property is slightly behaves different, right, for each particular component. This is a button. Let me see. I'll just say click me. Like that. Okay. So click me, and then I'm going to give it a location. Button1 dot location equals new point. Now I'll put this one 125 from the left and 25 from the top. Okay, so they're all going to be on the same horizontal plane, but they're going to be I'm saying vertical plane, but horizontally they'll be over a little bit, right? Same horizontal. All right. Horizontally they'll be placed over differently positions. Vertically they'll be the same height. All right, so, or distance from the top, I should say. Okay. So next one is text box. Text box 1 equals new text box, like that. Okay. Text box dot text. Now, when you set the text on a text box, you're setting the gut. You could read the text. Well, you can read the text on all these things, right? But you're setting the contents of that text box, right? Text box have lots of neat properties. You can make them single line, multi-line, but we'll just set the text here. Some default text like that. Okay, so then text box 1 dot location equals new point, and I'm going to put it 225, comma 25, like that. Now I've got my 3 components. I've created my 3 components and I've set properties on them. The next thing I need to do then is to add these components to the form. So simply go this. Let me get up here. This, hold on. This, right? This is a a keyword, right? It means this object that you're in. So this dot controls, the base class control has this controls collection. Okay, base controls dot add, and a collection has an add method. And now this is where the order depends on, if I put the button in first, the button will come up on the window first, right? If I put the label, but in this particular case, you won't notice it because I've got each one in a different position. So if I put label in, it's going to go in its position. If I put text box in, it's going to go in its position. If I didn't set the location and I added label 1, button 1, text box in that order, the last thing you'd see would be the text box, and you wouldn't wonder where the heck are all my other components, right? Because they're one on top of the other. Because their location is default, the upper left-hand corner of the window. But since I've explicitly set the location of each of these components, they will go in those, predetermined locations. So in this case, order doesn't necessarily matter, right? Because I'm putting the components button, label, and text box in specific places, right? So I can put anyone I want, anywhere I want. All right, this dot control, controls dot add, button 1. Okay, so just to drive the point home, right? I'll just put text box 1 next, right? Really, I want that to come over to the very right, and then this dot controls dot add button 1. Now button is going to be in the middle because that's where the location is set. Okay, so I've got all my, that's it for the initialize component method. The next method I need, it has to be a public method, and I'm not going to put a region on it. I'm just going to say public static void main, like that. And I don't need any special version of the main method. So the first thing I am going to do though is I'm just going to run the app, right? I don't have to create a specific instance of the window. I'm going to say application dot run new, right? I'm going to create new instance of component demo, and that creates my So the name of my class, right, that I've created here is Component Demo. It's a form, and it and this application.run method, application's a class, once again, in the System.Windows.Forms namespace, and the run method takes a form, and since Component Demo extends form, it is a form, and it will then start the event queue and run your program, right? And your window will pop up and start running. Alrighty, so let's see if I didn't screw something up here. This is always the moment of truth, right? Adding components. Let me do a directory. I got my source file there. Let me compile csc star.cs. All right, so it says error on line 18, the type of namespace. Oh, rectangle. I didn't notice that, man. If I was doing this live, at least somebody can send me a text message to say, hey, man, you're dorking something up. So come down here. Rectangle. Rec. That was close. Rectangle. Okay, rectangle. All right, that should do it. Control save. Alrighty. This is a perfect example, right, of don't type too much crap in, right, before you compile your code. Otherwise, you'll make a mistake, and then you'll have to go back and undork it. All right, so it compiled. We can do a test and say, yep, there's my executable file. And now let's run it. So start. I'm just going to. Well, I compiled it, right? I don't need a console, so I'm going to compile this one more time. But I'm going to do it with the slash target. WinX. Okay, so slash target WinX. So I'm just going to compile this to a Windows executable, and then I can say slash dot slash start. Sorry, start dot slash. Let's go about backslash for the right one. Okay, dot slash. Component demo. All right, so it popped up way up here, which is where it was supposed to, right? Now, okay, so there we have the window. Let me minimize this. All right, so here's our window. We can change the size, right? But and so I put the label. This is 2525 from the upper left-hand corner of this window. This is the main window, right? This is the label. Click me, right? See, I can click my button, right? Doesn't do anything, and we'll take care of that in a second, right? So here's my I can change the text in it, right? If I want to. Doesn't do anything. It just has text there. But what I will do is I'll hook these up now, all right? And then and that won't take too long. What I'll do is I'm going to show you how to handle an event on this click me button. Whatever text you put in here in the text field will change the label text, okay? So let's go ahead and do that. Let's pull back up this code. All right. Now, the way that we do this is we have to have an event handler, okay? And it's probably a good idea now to go check the .NET Framework documentation so we can see what's going on. All right. And so here I'm in the, well, I was back on another thing. So let me go ahead and go back to Google. All right. So I want to handle a button click, right? A click is an event on a button, right? All these components have certain events, right? So we're going to say System.Windows.Forms.Button. So we go to the button class, and we're going to take a look at the events. And what it's going to tell us is, in order to handle a click event, we have to have a certain type of delegate, right? And if you're just starting out, this stuff is quite confusing. But once you do one or two, then it's like, you're a pro. All right, so we don't need the properties. We scroll down to the documentation, past the methods. There's a lot of methods in here too, right? You can do a lot of stuff with a button. Let's go to the events. Haha. Okay, so we have lots of events, right? And so an event is something that we can write code that will respond to if it happens to a button, right? If you looked at video 12.1, you notice that a GUI program is just sitting there intercepting all kinds of events, right? If I click on a component, if I do a keystroke, right? If the button's got the focus or the window, whatever, right? It knows. That's why the bounds of a component has a certain bounds, right? If I click on a button, the operating system knows I clicked on that button, and then it will allow me to write code that will respond to that click. So let's click on the click event. All right, here we go. And what we're looking for is this right here, the type. The type of delegate, right, is an event handler, okay? The event handler delegate. Now you're like, well, what the heck does that mean? Okay, well, we have to look up the event handler. So in the system's namespace, okay, we'll go back up here to the forms namespace. At least I thought that's what it was going to do. Oh yeah, it's thinking. Okay. Sure is taking a sweet ass time. There we go. All right. Okay, System.Forms, I really just want the system namespace, right? So I'm going to minimize this window and scroll up here. At least I think I'm going to scroll up. There we go. System.Windows. I just want system. I don't want System.Windows. Oh, maybe I need to go up one more. There we go. Okay. .NET Framework Class Library. I'm telling you, it's easier just to go to Google and type it in. System namespace. Click on System namespace. All right, it's thinking. See, oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm coming down to Event Handler Delegate. Event Handler. Well, at least I think it's in the system namespace. Event args. Let me see what I'm at. Oh, classes. I should go down farther. Structures, interfaces. Delegates. All right, I got to get to the delegate section. Event Handler Delegate. Okay, Event Handler Delegate. It represents the method. Let me just highlight it here. Represents the method that will handle an event that has no event data. So we just click on the button. There's really no event data that we need to worry about. All right, so we click on Event Handler. And what we're looking for is the structure of the method, right? The signature and how to write an event handler. So what it says is, in the syntax, this is where you get this. The syntax for an event handler is void, and then event handler, object sender, and event args e, right? Now sender and e are just parameter names. You could name these things anything you want, but that's when the delegate is declared here, right? In other words, this is the delegate type. When I create a delegate or an event handler method that responds to a button click, I have to have the same signature as this delegate type. So let's go back to the code. So in other words, really the important part is it's got to be a public method, return void, right? In other words, it returns nothing, and I can give it any name I want. It just has to have an object as the first parameter and the event args as the second parameter. Event args is a class in the system namespace. All right. So let's go back to the code. So I come down here. Oh, all right. I'm going to put it up under here, under this private. So these are public methods. All right. Public void. I'm going to say button click handler. Button like that. Object sender and event args e like that. Okay. Now I can do anything I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the text from the text box and I'm going to set the label. And the way I said that is kind of back-asswards, right? So really I'm going to say I want to set the labels text with the text from the text box, okay? So I'm going to say label 1 dot text equals text box 1.text, just like that. All right, and then what I might do is clear or set the text string in the text box to nothing right after that. So text box 1.text equals, and the best way to do that is string.empty, like that. Okay. Now let's go ahead and now how do we hook this up? So I have a button. All right, I've got my event handler method, Button.Click handler, and I'm going to go up here to the button and I'm going to just put it right underneath. Button 1, click. Now the way that you add, so a click is a delegate type. Click is an event, which is a delegate type, which is an event, right? It's an event, but the type is of an event handler. And what that means is you add, in other words, it's a collection. I think it's a linked list or a list or something like that. It's a collection of event delegates, right? That methods, in other words, that it's going to go through and call. In other words, I can have more than one event handler method assigned to the click event, and I might show you that in another video. But the way that you do it is you have to say plus equals. Okay, plus equals. You're adding another event, okay, to this click event. So click, I'm sorry, Button.Click handler is the name of my method, just like that. Now to make this more explicit, you could say new event handler, like that, and that would work too. So in other words, event handler is the delegate type, right? Event handler, and this is a name of a method that is an event handler. Okay, but with .NET 2.0, I think it was .NET 2.0. It's been so long ago. They let you just assign the name, right? And all that magic happens behind the scenes. This is the name of the method that's going to handle the click on that button. And you could have more than one, but for now we just need one. So let's save it and compile it. So we're going to bring back up the thing here. So let's go compile. Alrighty, everything looks fine. And clear the screen. We don't really need to do that. And just run it again. All right. Okay, so here's our window, right? So if I hit click me, well, it's got default text. Let me change that text. I'll say new text. And then the label should change. Yeah, new text. See, okay. And it clears the text box, which is exactly what we wanted it to do, right? Okay. Now let's do that again. More text. All right, label 1. Every time you click it. And that's all it does. Right now, if I clicked it like that, it'd be blank. All right. It's like, oh, there's no label. Yes, there is. I'm here. Haha. There we go. Ah, the label's back. Okay, great. So, alrighty, now to review, you have a window. This is your window. It's a form. And in order to add components to it, you have to declare the components in your code. Let's pull up the code. We've got 3 components, right? Controls, label, a button, and a text box. In order to create the control itself, the form, the window, I have 2 constructors. I have a default constructor and I have a regular old constructor, right? And this constructor, the second constructor, takes 4 arguments and creates a rectangle and assigns that to the bounds property, okay? And then I set the text to component demo, and then I create a method, or call a method called initialize component. And in the initialize component method, I actually create the label, create the button, create the text box, set the various properties, right? When I create the button, I actually add the event handler, and then I create the text box, right? Then I add the controls. And because I've put explicit locations on these controls, the order in which I add them does not matter. And in another video, I'll show you how to use a flow layout panel. You don't have to worry about putting locations on your controls. And then you just use a flow layout panel, and they'll flow in however which way you tell it to flow, which is a lot more convenient. Then I have a button-click handler method, and what it does is it takes, all it does here is I've taken the text from the text box and set the text property on the label with it. And then I clear the text in the text box by setting it to string.empty. Finally, I have a main method, static, and in there I call application.run, and I create an instance of the component demo, which is the class that I'm in, right, which is a form. And that application.run method requires a form. And that's it, right? Let's run it one more time just to play around. Well, it's run still. Okay, so click me. Oh, it's blank again. Just put some random text. There we go. Okay, hello. Gotta have hello world in a program, right? For those of you who learned how to program in C and earlier in assembly. Okay, that's it for today. If you have questions, as always, you can hit me up at rick@pulpfreepress.com. I'll be happy to answer questions. And if you have an idea for a specific video, if you're having trouble with something, I can put out a special video and help you out with that. And once again, this lecture comes from Chapter 12 of my book, C# for Artists. I'll give one more shameless slug for that book. C# for Artists, 2nd edition, available at pulpfreepress.com. If you look down in the comments section, there's a link to that book. And I'll put my email address in there as well. Okay, you guys have a great day, and happy coding.